Hello, second grade Smarties, and welcome to Wit and Wisdom Module 2, Lesson 23. So today, our focus question is going to be the same focus question that we've had, and that is, what life lesson can we learn from the story of Johnny Appleseed? Now remember, I like to think of these questions like a pizza. Our big pizza question, that's our essential question. We can only take small bites at a time. We can't eat a whole pizza in one bite, right? Our pizza slice question, that's our focus question for this unit, is what life lesson can we learn from the story of Johnny Appleseed? So that means that we are looking at Johnny Appleseed's story a little bit at a time to figure out what is a life lesson we can learn. The pizza bite question, or the question that we want to answer today, is what's happening in Johnny Appleseed by Kellogg. Now, we have already read a story about Johnny Appleseed, the story of Johnny Appleseed. We are going to be reading another version today of Johnny Appleseed's story. So we are going to be reading a different version. Now, we have talked about legends in the past, and legends are stories that talk about a historic topic, but sometimes it has magical elements to it. So this version is a folk tale and legend about Johnny Appleseed. So this story will have elements of a legend, like Legend of the Blue Bonnet and the story of Johnny Appleseed, that make the story more dramatic and exaggerated from the true history about Johnny Appleseed or John Chapman. More exaggerated stories, so more magical or really crazy stories, can sometimes be called tall tales. So tall tales are stories that have really crazy elements to it. So think about Paul Bunyan, okay? And his ability to cut down entire trees with one swing. So that is an example of a tall tale. Paul Bunyan, he might have chopped trees down, but could he chop a giant tree in one swing? Probably not. So exaggerated stories are called tall tales. All right, so we are going to be talking about what we notice and wonder in this story, but we're also going to be talking about the characters, the setting, important events, and elements in this story. So go ahead and get yourself in a quiet space, and let's listen to the tall tale about Johnny Appleseed. John Chapman, I'm going to make myself smaller. Whoop. John Chapman, who later became known as Johnny Appleseed, was born on September 26, 1774, when the apples on the trees surrounding his home in Leominster, Massachusetts, were as red as the autumn leaves. John's first years were hard. His father left the family to fight in the Revolutionary War, and his mother and his baby brother died before his second birthday. By the time John turned 6, his father had remarried and settled in Longmeadow, Massachusetts. Within a decade, their little house was overflowing with 10 more children. Nearby was an apple orchard. Like most early American families, the Chapmans picked their apples in the fall, stored them in the cellar for winter eating, and used them to make sauces, cider, vinegar, and apple butter. John loved to watch the spring blossoms slowly turn into the glowing fruits of autumn. Watching the apples grow inspired in John a love of all nature. He often escaped from his boisterous household to the tranquil woods. The animals sensed his gentleness and trusted him. As soon as John was old enough to leave home, he set out to explore the vast wilderness to the west. When he reached the Allegheny Mountains, he cleared a plot of land and planted a small orchard with the pouch of apple seeds he carried with him. John walked hundreds of miles through Pennsylvania forest, living like the Indians he befriended on the trail. As he traveled, he cleared the land for many more orchards. He was sure the pioneer families would be arriving before long, and he looked forward to supplying them with apple trees. When a storm struck, he found shelter in a hollow log or built a lean-to. On clear nights, he stretched out under the stars. Over the next few years, John continued to visit and care for his new orchards. The winter slowed him down, but he survived happily on a diet of butternuts. One spring, he met a band of men who boasted that they could lick their weight in wildcats. They were amazed to hear that John wouldn't hurt an animal and had no use for a gun. They challenged John to compete at wrestling, the favorite frontier sport. He suggested a more practical contest, a tree chopping match. The woodsmen eagerly agreed. When the sawdust settled, there was no question about who had come on top. John was pleased that the land for his largest orchard had been so quickly cleared. He thanked the exhausted woodsmen for their help and began planting. During the next few years, John continued to move westward. Whenever he ran out of apple seeds, he hiked to the eastern cider presses to replenish his supply. Before long, John's plantings were spread across the state of Ohio. Meanwhile, pioneer families were arriving in search of home sites and farmland. John had located his orchard on the routes he thought they'd be traveling, as he hoped the settlers were eager to buy his young trees. John went out of his way to lend a helping hand to his new neighbors. Often he would give his trees away. People affectionately called him Johnny Appleseed, and he began using that name. He particularly enjoyed entertaining children with tales of his wilderness adventures and stories from the Bible. In 1812, the British incited the Indians to join them in another war against the Americans. The settlers feared that Ohio would be invaded from Lake Erie. It grieved Johnny that his friends were fighting each other. But when he saw the smoke of burning cabins, he ran through the night, shouting a warning at every door. After the war, people urged Johnny to build a house and settle down. He replied that he lived like a king in his wilderness home, and he returned to the forest he loved. During his long absences, folks enjoyed sharing their recollections of Johnny. They retold his stories, and sometimes they even exaggerated them a bit. Some recalled Johnny sleeping in a treetop hammock and chatting with the birds. Others remembered that a rattlesnake had attacked his foot. Fortunately, Johnny's feet were as tough as elephants' hides, so the fangs didn't penetrate. It was said that Johnny had once tended a wounded wolf and then kept him for a pet. An old hunter swore he'd seen Johnny frolicking with a bear family. The storytellers outdid each other with tall tales about his feats of survival in the untamed wilderness. As the years passed, Ohio became too crowded for Johnny. He moved to the wilds of Indiana, where he continued to clear land for his orchards. When the settlers began arriving, Johnny recognized some of the children who had listened to his stories. Now they had children of their own. It made Johnny's old heart glad when they welcomed him as a beloved friend and asked to hear his tales again. When Johnny passed 70, it became difficult for him to keep up with his work. Then, in March of 1845, while trudging through a snowstorm near Fort Wayne, Indiana, he became ill for the first time in his life. Johnny asked for shelter in a settler's cabin, and a few days later, he died there. Curiously, Johnny's stories continued to move westward without him. Folks maintained that they'd seen him in Illinois or that he'd greeted them in Missouri, Arkansas, or Texas. Others were certain he'd planted trees on the slopes of the Rocky Mountains or in California's distant valleys. Even today, people still claim they've seen Johnny Appleseed. All right, so what are some big differences you noticed between this book and the other version we read? What are some things that you heard or saw that were different? Tell me in the puzzle. So some things that I saw that were different or heard that were different is all the examples of how he interacted with nature in the wilderness. We also heard stories from other people, those tall tales. Another difference that I heard was that John Chapman really planted lots of orchards, and he worked with Native Americans and settlers. I also noticed a big difference in that he challenged the woodsmen to a tree chopping contest. So there were lots of things that were the same about John Chapman in this story and the last story, but there were also some differences. All right. So now we're going to look deeper into this story. So we're going to talk about what is happening. All right. So the first thing that we want to answer is, what was the setting of this story? All right. So listen very closely. By the time John turned 6, his father had remarried and settled in Longmeadow, Massachusetts. Within a decade, their little house was overflowing with 10 more children. Nearby was an apple orchard. Like most early American families, the Chapmans picked their apples in the fall, stored them in the cellar for winter eating, and used them to make sauces, cider, vinegar, and apple butter. John loved to watch the spring blossoms slowly turn into the glowing fruit of autumn. Watching the apples grow inspired in John a love of all nature. He often escaped from his boisterous household to the tranquil woods. The animals sensed his gentleness and trusted him. As soon as John was old enough to leave home, he set out to explore the vast wilderness to the west. When he reached the Allegheny Mountains, he cleared a plot of land and planted a small orchard with a pouch of apple seeds he carried with him. All right, so we're going to pause for a second. On the last page, what was the setting of John Chapman's story? Tell me in the puzzle. What state did he grow up in? He grew up in the state of Massachusetts, but then he left home and traveled through the wilderness. Why did John leave home? Tell me in the puzzle. So in the story, we know that John left home because watching the apples grow inspired a love for nature. John Chapman loved nature and wanted to be around it. In this book, in these pages, there was one word. Whoo, Miss Mason's tongue-tied. All right, so there was one word that is a vocabulary word, and that word is wilderness. Say wilderness for me. So the wilderness is a wild place where only animals live. So John wanted to be in the wilderness, which means he wanted to be surrounded by animals and nature. All right. Now, I want you to be thinking as I read this page, who did John befriend along his journey? John walked hundreds of miles through the Pennsylvania forest, living like the Indians he befriended on the trail. As he traveled, he cleared the land for many more orchards. He was sure the pioneer families would be arriving before long, and he looked forward to supplying them with apple trees. So, who did John befriend? Befriend means to make friends with. Who did he make friends with along his journey? Tell me in the puzzle. On this page, we learn that he made friends with the Indians. So he befriended the Indians and he tried to live like the Indians in the wilderness. One spring, he met a band of men who boasted that they could lick their weight in wildcats. They were amazed to hear that John wouldn't hurt an animal and had no use for a gun. They challenged John to compete at wrestling, the favorite frontier sport. He suggested a more practical contest, a tree chopping match. The woodsmen eagerly agreed. And here's the illustration of all the men having their contest. When the sawdust settled, there was no question about who had come on top. John was pleased that the land for his largest orchard had been so quickly cleared. He thanked the exhausted woodsmen for their help and began planting. So, in this section of the book, we meet another group of people that John Chapman befriended. He befriended woodsmen and pioneers, right? What did we learn about John Chapman from his contest with the woodsmen? What did he not have a use for? He didn't have a use for guns. And what were the woodsmen surprised about with John? Tell me in the puzzle. They were surprised that he didn't hunt animals. Why didn't he hunt animals? Because he didn't want to hurt them. So thinking about John not wanting to use a gun to hurt animals, what is a word that we can use to describe John Chapman? What's a word that we could use to describe him? Tell me in the puzzle. We can describe him as kind, but in this event, when he asks them to do a tree chopping contest, he's being very smart, right? Because he needed that land cleared for his apple orchards. So along the way, he made friends and he helped his friends, but he also had friends that helped him and sometimes didn't know they were helping him expand his apple orchards. So this is something that we learned about in our other Johnny Appleseed story, right? We learned that he took care of animals. He loved nature. He loved animals. In 1812, the British incited the Indians to join them in another war against the Americans. The settlers feared that Ohio would be invaded from Lake Erie. It grieved Johnny that his friends were fighting each other. But when he saw the smoke of burning cabins, he ran through the night shouting a warning at every door. Some recalled Johnny sleeping in a treetop hammock and chatting with the birds. Others remembered that a rattlesnake had attacked his foot. Fortunately, Johnny's feet were as tough as elephant hide, so the fangs didn't penetrate. It was said that Johnny had once tended a wounded wolf and then kept him for a pet. An old hunter swore he'd seen Johnny frolicking with a bear family. The storytellers outdid each other with tall tales about his feats of survival in the untamed wilderness. So what do you notice about the kinds of stories people told about Johnny Appleseed? What do you notice about the stories they told about him? Tell me in the puzzle, what do you notice about all these stories? Some of them seem kind of big, right? They're tall tales. They are exaggerated. So there's a possibility that he could have slept in a hammock, but do humans and birds talk to each other? Not really, but it's a tall tale about Johnny Appleseed. These were stories. These were made-up tales that people made about him. The example with the snake. I don't know. It might be possible for someone to have skin that's as tough as elephant hide, but think about that tale with the rattlesnake. Most rattlesnakes would be able to bite a person, right? So that's another tall tale. We also learned in the last story from the legend of Johnny Appleseed that he played with the 3 bear cubs and the mother bear watched them. So this story is a greatly exaggerated story that is sometimes hard to believe. For example, something that's hard to believe is that a wolf would be a pet for a person. That seems kind of silly. It's hard to believe. right. It made Johnny's old heart glad when they welcomed him as a beloved friend and asked to hear his tales again. When John passed 70, it became difficult for him to keep his work up. Then, in March of 1845, while trudging through a snowstorm near Fort Wayne, Indiana, he became ill for the first time in his life. Johnny asked for shelter in a settler's cabin, and a few days later, he died. Curiously, Johnny's stories continue to move westward without him. Folks maintain that they'd seen him in Illinois or that he greeted them in Missouri, Arkansas, or Texas. Others were certain that he'd planted trees on the slopes of the Rocky Mountains or in California's distant valleys. Even today, people still claim they've seen Johnny Appleseed. So, after we listened to the story, I wanted you to think about differences in this version and the other version we've read. How does this version of the story of Johnny Appleseed end? How does this story end? Tell me in the puzzle. So this story is different. This version is different because it says that John Chapman died while he was recovering in a settler's cabin. And the other version of Johnny Appleseed, what happened at the end of that story? Tell me in the puzzle. So in the other version that we read, we learned that John Chapman became very sick, but that Indians helped him get better so he could keep going on his journey. He did not die at the end of that story, but he died at the end of this version of the story. So when we read different versions of stories of people that were real, it's really hard sometimes to find what is the real information and what is the exaggerated information. We are going to be talking more about the real history of John Chapman or Johnny Appleseed. But again, for this lesson, we introduce this new version so you can see that stories can change over time. Different people can tell the same story, but add other elements into it. All right, so as we are thinking about this version of the story of Johnny Appleseed, this version is just called Johnny Appleseed. We usually think about talking about the setting, the characters, the problem and resolution. For this retelling, we are going to practice retelling the story by talking about the setting, then the characters, and then talking about an important beginning, middle events, and an ending event. So looking at the story chart, we know that the story takes place, it starts in Massachusetts, right? It starts in Massachusetts with Johnny Appleseed dreaming of leaving to walk in the wilderness and plant apple trees. So we can say Johnny Appleseed started in Massachusetts with John Chapman. First, so here's our beginning event. John left home to explore the West. So that was the beginning event. That was the big, important beginning event. Then John had a contest with woodsmen because he would not hurt animals, and they chopped down trees for his orchards. So that's an important middle event. When John was away, here's another important event. People told tall tales about John Chapman. In the end, John Chapman got very sick during a snowstorm and died, but people still tell his story today. So when I retold that story, I talked about the setting, where the story started. I talked about who the story was about. I talked about the beginning event. So in the puzzle, I want you to tell me what happened at the beginning of the story. Tell me in the puzzle. So at the beginning of the story, John leaves home to travel the West in the wilderness. Okay? As he's traveling west, he tries to live like the Indians that he becomes friends with. But then what happened when he met the woodsmen? What did he do when he met the woodsmen? He had a contest. Why did he have that contest, that tree cutting contest? Because the woodsman challenged him because he wouldn't hurt animals. And because they had that tree cutting contest, what was John able to do with all that clear land? He was able to build apple orchards. All right. Then the other middle event, while John was away, people told tall tales. What were those tall tales about? Tell me in the puzzle. Those tall tales were about Johnny Appleseed's adventures in the wilderness with the tree, with the, what is that called? With the tree hammock and him talking with birds, the injured wolf becoming his pet, playing with the bear cubs, not getting bit by a rattlesnake because his skin was so tough. So those are examples of stories that happened in the middle. In the end, what happened to John Chapman? He became very ill during a snowstorm in Indiana and died in a settler's home. So as we are retelling the story, we want to think about the setting, the characters, a beginning event, 2 middle events, and an end event. All right, so we have spent some time with John Chapman, and this should look very familiar. This is the timeline that we have been working on with talking about the American West. So we started with the Buffalo are back, and then we moved into the Plains Indians, and then we moved into the Journey of a Pioneer, and then we moved into the Legend of the Blue Bonnet, and now we are talking about John Chapman. So as you can see, I have different colors for the different books we've read. In the green, this is the color green, Smarties. Look at where I have my information about John Chapman. What do you notice about John Chapman's information? Look at all of this section. What is something that you notice in the timeline? Tell me in the puzzle. So I noticed that John Chapman, in our timeline, he was alive during the 1800s, during the 1700s and 1800s. He was born in the late 1700s and passed away in the mid 1800s. During this time, that was when we saw wars between the settlers and the Native Americans. We saw people going on the Oregon Trail. So John Chapman was in the middle of all of it. So he was able to see how Indians lived, how the pioneers lived. He saw the wars that happened. What do we know that Johnny Appleseed tried to do between the Indians and the settlers? What did he try to do between those two groups? He tried to make peace, right? So when we are thinking about the timeline of the American West, we can think about John Chapman living during the late 1700s to the mid 1800s. All right, so our story, the story of Johnny Appleseed and Johnny Appleseed, A Tall Tale, these are all based on the real person, John Chapman. So we are going to look at a article about who was Johnny Appleseed. Now, this is an informational article. It's going to give us true information about John Chapman. So here is the first page. It says 200 years ago, a man walked all over our country in his bare feet. He planted apple trees. People called him Johnny Appleseed. The true story of Johnny Appleseed. Johnny Appleseed wasn't born with that name. His real name was John Chapman. He is famous for planting many apple trees when our country first began. He is also famous for being a good citizen. John's apple seedlings. In the 1800s, many people in our country moved west. They were called settlers. They built homes and set up towns. But before they could do any of that, they needed apple trees. Why? It sounds strange, but back then, some settlers had to plant fruit trees if they wanted to build homes out west. Planting fruit trees proved that they would stay and take care of the land. John went out west before the settlers. He planted apple seeds. The seeds grew into small trees called seedlings. When the settlers arrived, John sold the seedlings to them. Now they had fruit trees. They could build homes. A good citizen. John was generous. People didn't always have enough money to pay for the seedlings. He let them pay when they could. John wore ripped clothes, but he didn't mind. If someone gave him new clothes, he often gave them away to a person who needed them more. John was kind too. If he saw a hurt animal, he would help it. John was friendly to everyone. He loved to tell stories and make people laugh. People today remember John for all his apple trees and for his kind, generous heart. All right, so that was a true informational article about John Chapman. So, what is a true fact that you just heard about John Chapman? Tell me in the puzzle. So, a fact that I heard about John Chapman is that he traveled to places and planted those apple trees before they got there. Is that a fact that you heard too? Yeah, and he knew that if apple trees were planted or fruit trees were planted, people would stay and take care of them. I also learned that he was very generous to settlers and pioneers that could not afford the seedling trees. He gave them away and took payment whenever people were ready. So I want you to think about the two stories that we've read about Johnny Appleseed and the informational article about John Chapman. Are any of these facts about John Chapman different from what we read about the character Johnny Appleseed? No, right? The article told us that he was kind and generous. But did it talk about him doing a tree chopping contest? No. Did it talk about him wearing a pan on his head? No, it did say that he wore ripped clothes, right? So we knew that he was kind and generous. He gave things away to other people. All right, so Smarties, in Miss Mason's class, we are going to be adding a page to our digital book that we made last week. So we are going to be adding a fun fact page. So we answered the question, what lesson can we learn from Johnny Appleseed? We are going to add a 6th page or a 7th page. I believe it's a 7th page. And we're going to add a fun fact. Johnny Appleseed was a real man named John Chapman. Okay, so this is a fun fact. So it's real information. John Chapman blank. What is a fact that you could add in here about John Chapman? Tell me in the puzzle. What's a fact that you learned about John Chapman? So that fact that you just put in the puzzle, you are going to have a chance to go into your digital book in Book Creator and put that fun fact. All right. And of course, we finish every lesson with a deep dive. All right, so we are talking about how we can improve our writing using irregular past tense verbs. So to get better at using past tense verbs, we have to practice. So looking at our past tense verbs, we are going to look at the present tense and then talk about the past tense. So for example, the first word that we have on here is bring. What would be the past tense for bring? It's not bringed, it is brought. She will bring the apple tree to me. She brought the apple tree to me. Brought is irregular. It's an irregular past tense verb. All right, what about the word no? What is the irregular past tense for no? Tell me in the puzzle. The irregular past tense for no is knew. I knew it was going to be a good day today. Knew. All right, the next one. This is the present tense verb for fly. What would be the irregular past tense verb for fly? The bird will fly in the sky. The bird flew in the sky. So F-L-E-W, not like sickness flew in the past. All right. Our next word that has an irregular past tense verb is eat. What is the past tense for eat? Tell me in the ed puzzle. So the past tense for eat is ate. She ate her ice cream at nighttime. All right, the next one is get. I get to go to school today. What would be the past? Tell me in the puzzle. It's not getted, it is got. I got to go to school today. All right, we've seen this one before. What is the past tense for the verb build? Built, right? It's not builded, it is built. Our next verb is the word leave. She leaves for school every day. What would be the past for leave? Left. I left for school today. And see. I see Miss Mason walking to her car. What would be the past for see? Tell me in the ed puzzle. Saw, right? That's like Seesaw, the app that we use for some of our learning. So, sorry, friends, my throat is scratchy. So looking at all our present tense verbs, all of these past tense verbs have irregular spellings. That means they are all spelled differently than the base word or the present tense verb. So when we are using these words, we want to make sure that our verbs make sense. So looking, Miss Mason is, woo! All right, remember in our math lesson, we talked about taking a deep breath. Let's do that right now. Ready? Okay, let's try this again. So when we are writing and we are having to use a past tense verb, some of them might be irregular spellings, right? So let's look at this sentence and see if it needs an irregular past tense verb. Along the way, Johnny sold young trees to pioneers. What was the action word in this sentence? Along the way, Johnny sold young trees to pioneers. In the ed puzzle, I want you to tell me what was the action word in this sentence? The action word was sold. What is wrong with that past tense verb? It's not spelled correctly. What is the past tense for sell? Tell me in the ed puzzle. The past tense for sell is sold. It has an irregular spelling. So not every verb is going to have an ed at the end if it is past tense. So when we are writing, it's important to go back and check our verbs to make sure we are using the correct tense or spelling. All right, Smarties, that was a long lesson where we did a lot of deep thinking, but we kept a growth mindset. Miss Mason even had to take a second to pause to take a deep breath, and that's okay. Teaching can be really hard sometimes, especially when you talk for a really long time. Your brain can get kind of squished, but that's okay because I know as a good learner, I can do hard things and keep that growth mindset. All right, Smarties, I will see you tomorrow with another lesson about John Chapman, or also known as Johnny Appleseed. Happy learning, Smarties.